She walked into the room like she owned it. Clipboard in hand, white coat crisp, the confidence practically dripping off her like perfume. Her voice, sharp and practiced, commanded attention, not through respect, but through sheer force. It was the kind of confidence that didn't wait to be earned, the kind that assumed superiority from the start. As soon as the conversation began, the tone was already set. She wasn't here for a dialogue. She was here to dominate. The target of her performance was clear. Her eyes, cold and calculating, locked on the woman seated across from her. There was no curiosity in her gaze, no desire to understand or empathize, only assessment, judgment. And just like that, she began her routine, not with questions or concern, but with assumptions dressed up as facts. Every word dripped with condescension. Every pause was a moment for everyone else in the room to absorb. Just how clever, how righteous, how enlightened she was. She spoke with a smirk barely hidden behind her professional facade. Her credentials hung on the wall, but it was her words that she used like weapons. There was no room for nuance, no patience for difference, just a performance of superiority. The subject of her scorn was met with rhetorical traps, leading questions designed to humiliate, not illuminate. Each comment carefully calibrated to elicit a reaction, not for the sake of truth, but for the sake of spectacle. It wasn't enough to challenge. She needed to embarrass, needed to make a point not just to her audience, but to herself, to prove that she could dismantle someone with nothing but her intellect and a touch of venom. That's what this was really about. Not science, not care, not healing, power, prestige. A flex in a place that was supposed to be about humility and service. The setting made it worse. A sterile room meant for safety and trust had become a stage. Instead of offering clarity, she created confusion. Instead of giving reassurance, she sowed discomfort. And through it all, she maintained the practiced smile of someone who thought she was doing the world a favor. Her sense of superiority wasn't just personal, it was ideological. She spoke like she had a monopoly on truth. Like anyone who thought differently was simply uneducated, backward, or dangerous. But it wasn't just what she said. It was how she said it. The little sighs, the raised eyebrow, the way she leaned back, giving the impression that even standing too close to disagreement might somehow stain her. The fake politeness only made it worse, because it wasn't real. None of it was. Not the concern, not the courtesy, not the charm. It was all a layer of performance over contempt. And the worst part? She wanted to be seen doing it. There was something performative in the way she looked around the room, checking for reactions. Was the message landing? Was the audience impressed? She wasn't just speaking to the woman. She was speaking at her and through her to everyone else who dared hold a different view. She turned a private moment into public theater. A medical conversation into a morality play. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words were laced with enough poison to do damage without volume, and every phrase seemed carefully selected to disarm under the guise of intelligence. She wielded her education like a blade, not to cut through ignorance, but to cut down anyone who didn't kneel before it. Every credential she had became a wall between her and the people she was supposed to serve. And in her mind, that wall was necessary, because if people didn't agree with her, they simply weren't worth reaching. There was no room for empathy in that room, no space for respect. It had been replaced by a cold, calculated display of ego wrapped in liberal smugness. And though she never raised her hand, it was clear that what she delivered that day was an assault, not physical, but psychological. A takedown dressed as a consultation. And every word was delivered with the confidence of someone who believed they could never be wrong. She sat there, not flinching, not interrupting, not defending, just present, composed. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, her gaze steady, not confrontational, but alert. The storm that swirled around her in the form of snide remarks and veiled jabs didn't shake her. It would have been easy to rise to it, to respond with the same sharpness, to match tone for tone, but she chose a different path. one that didn't require volume to be heard. There's a particular kind of strength that shows itself in stillness, a quiet confidence that doesn't need to announce itself with theatrics. She embodied that completely, not because she lacked words, but because she knew the weight of silence, the power of restraint, the dignity of choosing grace over reaction. Each moment the conversation dragged on, each layer of condescension added to the dialogue, she remained unmoved. Not out of fear, but out of clarity. She knew what was being done, and she also knew she didn't need to play along. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was choice. A deliberate decision not to sink into the shallow games being played, not to validate cruelty with retaliation, not to lose herself in someone else's need for control. That kind of resolve doesn't come from pride. It comes from a deep understanding of self, of knowing what you stand for and refusing to compromise it, even under pressure. She didn't shrink, she didn't cower, but she also didn't puff up in defiance. She simply existed, completely, aware, completely grounded. There was something unnerving about it to those who tried to provoke her. It's unsettling when someone doesn't react the way you expect, when you're trying to pull emotion out of someone and all you get is calm. That kind of presence disarms more effectively than any comeback. It throws the aggressor off balance, leaves them grasping for a new strategy. And that's exactly what happened. Every dismissive word thrown her way seemed to echo in the room, unanswered, but not because she had nothing to say. It was because she didn't need to prove anything to anyone. This wasn't about her ego. It wasn't about winning an argument. It was about preserving something far more valuable, her integrity. She carried herself with a kind of quiet authority that doesn't scream for attention. It simply exists. And it fills the room, whether others acknowledge it or not. There was no need to argue her worth. It was evident in her posture, in the patience with which she listened, in the grace with which she endured. What some might have mistaken for passivity was, in truth, discipline. The kind that comes from knowing that some moments don't deserve a reaction, that not every attack needs to be met with fire. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply not engage. And in choosing not to react, she robbed the moment of the drama it was reaching for. She took the oxygen out of the flame. Others watched. They noticed. Maybe not in the moment, maybe not consciously. But the contrast was impossible to ignore. One person was performing, trying to dominate. The other was simply being, fully present, fully in control of herself. There was a kind of strength in that stillness that couldn't be mimicked, a force that didn't come from volume or status, but from a place far more secure. She didn't fold, and she didn't lash out. She waited. Not for revenge, not for validation, but for the truth of the situation to reveal itself, because it always does. Time has a way of showing who people truly are. And she understood that. Understood that endurance in some moments is more powerful than any argument could ever be. That dignity, when protected, becomes its own kind of defiance. While the room buzzed with tension and judgment, she chose to hold her peace. Not because she was defeated, but because she was unshakable. And that kind of stillness, that kind of control, it unsettles those who rely on intimidation. It exposes the weakness in those who use arrogance as a shield. Without raising her voice, without raising a finger, she held her ground. And sometimes 7 minutes. That's all it took for the entire atmosphere to shift. The same pristine, tightly controlled environment that once echoed with cold confidence suddenly cracked. It started subtly, just a flicker of uncertainty, a sound in the distance that didn't quite belong. But like a hairline fracture in glass, once it began, it spread fast and without mercy. Within moments, the illusion of control collapsed. The calm, clinical efficiency she had flaunted so proudly was replaced by a current of chaos no one could ignore. The alarms were the first to break through. Sharp, unrelenting, mechanical sounds piercing through the tension like a blade. Monitors beeped, lights flashed, and the once quiet hallway outside stirred into disarray. People began moving faster. Voices rose in urgency. Doors opened. Feet rushed past. The hum of order was drowned by the roar of uncertainty, and in the middle of it all stood the woman who, just minutes before, had radiated an unshakable sense of superiority. It was as if the room itself had turned on her. The confidence that had filled her voice earlier began to falter, shrinking beneath the weight of real crisis. Her calm demeanor dissolved as reality took over. The carefully curated mask slipped, and what lay beneath it was not composure or leadership, but hesitation, doubt. She stood still for a beat too long, eyes scanning the monitors, flipping through charts, reaching for answers that weren't there. She looked to others for support, but the same people she had subtly dismissed now moved past her with purpose, no longer interested in her presence or posturing. There's something brutally honest about a crisis. It doesn't care about status or performance. It strips everything down to what's real. Who you are in that moment becomes impossible to hide. And in her case, all the intellectual bravado, the sharp wit, the smug confidence, it amounted to nothing when faced with genuine pressure. She had all the theory in the world, but when the moment called for leadership, for clarity, for decisiveness, she froze. Around her, people jumped into action. Medical staff coordinated, supplies were called for, communication sparked like electricity. The room was no longer an audience, it was a battlefield, and her voice, once so dominant, was drowned out. Not because anyone silenced her, but because she had nothing of value to contribute in that moment. She had spent her energy asserting dominance in conversation, not preparing to lead when it mattered. It was a humbling scene, whether she recognized it or not. The hierarchy she had leaned on so heavily disappeared. Titles and credentials lost their meaning when lives were on the line and decisions had to be made quickly. People stopped looking at who had the most letters after their name and started following the ones who knew what to do, the ones who kept their heads, the ones who didn't need to talk down to others to feel secure. The timing couldn't have been more poetic. 7 minutes. Just long enough to let the sting of her words hang in the air. Just long enough for her to believe she had the upper hand. And then, like a trapdoor opening beneath her, the situation shifted. The stage she had taken so confidently crumbled, and the spotlight revealed a truth she hadn't anticipated. That real authority doesn't come from asserting it. It comes from earning it in moments of uncertainty. She didn't collapse. She didn't break down. But the faltering was obvious. The edge in her voice, the disorientation in her movements, the way her questions began to multiply without bringing solutions. She wasn't ready. She had been prepared to argue, not to act. And in those critical minutes, her earlier performance turned from impressive to irrelevant. People remember moments like these, not because of the failure alone, but because of what it reveals. And in those 7 minutes, everything shifted, not just the situation, but the perception. The pedestal she had built for herself cracked under pressure, and when the dust settled, there was no applause. Only the sound of work being done by others who hadn't said much earlier, but now their actions spoke loud enough for everyone. She didn't need permission to take control. There was no grand announcement, no dramatic shift in posture. She simply rose, metaphorically and literally, stepping into the chaos with a quiet decisiveness that immediately changed the tone of the room. Where others fumbled, she found clarity. Where there was hesitation, she offered direction. Not by shouting or asserting authority, but by moving with purpose, by knowing exactly what needed to be done and doing it. She asked no one to follow her, yet people did. Not because she demanded it, but because her presence in that moment was steady, focused, unshaken. While others searched for someone to lead, she was already 3 steps ahead, organizing, analyzing, responding. She didn't wait to be invited into the solution, she became the solution. One step, then another. One instruction, calmly given. A tool handed over. A question asked with precision, a diagnosis quietly confirmed. It was action born not of arrogance, but of preparation. The transformation wasn't loud. It didn't come with fanfare, but it was unmistakable. Those who had overlooked her before now turned to her instinctively. Because when pressure builds and panic sets in, people stop listening to the loudest voice and start following the clearest one. She became that clarity. Her energy shifted the room from disorder to function, from noise to direction. Her calm had weight. It grounded people. There was no bitterness in her expression, no sign of vindication. She wasn't acting to prove a point. She didn't have to. The point was proving itself. Every moment she operated with grace and confidence. The contrast between her and those who had dismissed her earlier grew sharper. Where there had once been condescension, now there was quiet respect, unspoken, but undeniable. She had nothing to prove, and yet everything about her proved it. She didn't gloat. She didn't glance around to see who was watching. That wasn't the motivation. She was there to help, to protect, to fix what was unraveling. And because she had stayed composed when it would have been easier to react, because she had stayed present, she was ready when the moment came. While others scrambled to adjust, she slipped into the role with an ease that made it seem as though she had been meant for it all along. Her knowledge was not worn like a badge. It was applied, intelligently, humbly, effectively. She asked the right questions. She listened to the answers. She moved with the kind of intuition that only comes from experience. Real, earned, not borrowed from books or titles. She wasn't trying to impress. She was trying to serve. And in doing so, she impressed more than any show of superiority ever could. Those around her, even the ones who had once looked down on her, now looked to her for guidance. It wasn't about control, it was about trust. She had earned it, not in theory, but in action. Every decision she made came from a place of certainty, not ego. She didn't rise because someone stepped aside. She rose because the moment needed her to. And while others found themselves lost in the storm, she became the anchor. The room, moments earlier buzzing with uncertainty, was now functioning with cohesion again. Orders were followed. Tensions lowered. The pulse of the place steadied because she had steadied herself first. In a crisis, people remember who brought order, who brought calm, and that memory sticks longer than any insult ever could. When it was all over, when the noise dimmed and the immediate danger passed, the silence that returned to the room was different. Not the cold silence of judgment, but the quiet that follows resolution. And in that stillness, people saw her, not just as a presence, but as a force. Someone who had stood tall without needing to rise above others. Someone who had taken command without taking credit. Someone who, when everything else fell apart, stood firm, not for show, not for ego, but because she was built for that moment. And it showed. In the aftermath, there was no need for applause, no need for recognition, though it would have been more than deserved. The events spoke for themselves. What had unfolded in those brief, intense minutes wasn't just a shift in circumstance, it was a revealing of character. People often imagine strength as something loud, something dramatic, but here, it was something else entirely. It was quiet composure under fire. It was grace in the face of insult. It was a kind of power that didn't need to raise its voice to be felt. She didn't walk away looking for validation. That wasn't her aim. But those who had seen her in action couldn't help but reevaluate everything they thought they knew. Perceptions were shattered, assumptions dissolved, and those who had underestimated her were left with the undeniable weight of her presence. She didn't need to remind them of what happened. The memory would linger, unshakable. What makes moments like these unforgettable isn't just the chaos or the crisis. It's what people choose to do in the middle of it. Some shrink, some flail, some posture. But a rare few step into the space with courage, humility, and competence. Not because they crave the spotlight, but because they know how to carry responsibility. She was one of those rare few. And maybe that's the greatest kind of victory, not one shouted from rooftops, but one earned in silence. In restraint. In action. The kind that leaves people speechless, not because they were silenced, but because they finally saw something real, something strong, something undeniably worthy of respect. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. There had been arrogance followed by panic, dismissiveness followed by failure. And yet, in that same space, there had also been quiet dignity followed by leadership, patience followed by action. That juxtaposition didn't need to be explained. It was felt, deeply, clearly, by everyone. She didn't humiliate anyone, though. She easily could have. She didn't retaliate or throw words back, even though they had come at her with cruelty. She simply stood in truth, waited for the moment, and answered it with everything she was. And that left an impact more profound than any confrontation ever could. Sometimes the world reveals its real leaders not in titles or accolades, but in unexpected trials. When the masks fall away, when the egos collapse and all that's left is the truth of who you are when no one's watching, those are the moments that define a person. That day, when it all fell apart, she didn't rise to meet the moment. She had been ready the entire time. And when the dust settled, she didn't have to say a word. Her actions had already told the